This topic is very broad. We are not going to get into all of it. I'll just show a few things that I found interesting enough to add. Society's responses and knowledge gaps. Let's look at the way articles mention keywords and how they are different in the use by politicians versus scientists. So this is analysis of media for 1985 to 2015. Looking at mean mentions per article in each case. So global warming, scientists have dropped its use basically because we moved to climate change as a more representative of the actual scientific problem, whereas politicians have been increasing its use over time, as Trump, for example, said zero point 0.2 degrees centigrade warming. So that's very easy to say. Global warming is very tiny compared to what people experience day to day or season to season, and this does lead to some problems in terms of people confusing weather and climate. Without going into all those details, think about words like fracking. So scientists did increase it over the last decade, but now politicians are ramping it up quite a bit. Hurricanes, not so different for politicians and scientists. So there is some consensus in the science and the impacts and the discussions, the solutions, etc. Recycling, again, similarly hasn't changed much over time. The Pew report, I think, also looked at the articles per source across the globe, so Africa, Asia, Europe, and so on, and they even did analysis of which one in each country is the most dominant one. So you can see that the mention of climate coverage or global warming ramped up, and then it has kind of come down with some spikes that are associated with either release of the IPCC reports or massive events like hurricanes or let's say the snowstorm in Japan and so on, floods in India, etc. And in the US, New York Times dominates the climate change coverage. They have multiple sections looking at climate issues. My favorite is to then say that I subscribe to New York Times now for a long time. And now I've been in India for a couple of years, so New York Times knows that I'm logging in from India. So the advertisements they put on my screen are India-specific, clothing from India, products from India, etc. So even though they are advocating climate change as a serious issue and the actions needed, food choices you have to make, all aspects of climate change, the revenue model is still about using big data to target readers for consumption. So is there a contradiction that we're trying to save the world but we will do it by selling more things? I'm not sure. US tends to be the most climate skeptic nation. Of course, there are many details. So this is showing share of people who are skeptical of climate change by level of skepticism. So this chart basically goes from climate is changing, but humans are not responsible, to the climate is not changing. So extreme views there. And these are the different regions. And you see, surprisingly, US dominates this. And it's good news for countries like India and China, where people are not struggling so much with accepting climate change, but that could well change in the future if solutions are not forthcoming and extreme events and the impacts begin to get worse. But we continue to talk about climate change. So there is always that relation as well. And in the US, if you look at Yale 360, which tracks these things very closely, there are details. It depends on how the question is asked. It depends on which party you belong to, and majority of them now accept climate change as something that's happening, but what to do about it can be different depending on how you ask the question. Carbon tax and how the revenues from carbon tax will be used, and so on and so forth. In the meantime, if you look at the history, American Petroleum Institute knew way back in 1954, and it received a report it had commissioned from California Institute of Technology indicating that fossil fuels are increasing level of atmospheric CO2. So not news to them at all. And in 1959, Edward Teller gave a speech in which he said carbon emissions from fossil fuels are contaminating the atmosphere and causing global warming. A physicist doing the good thing. But API President Frank Icard outlined a Presidential Science Advisory Committee report which said time is running out. CO2 from fossil fuels are altering the heat balance, causing marked changes in climate. So already the Keeling report was out, and some data was already available to look at the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere and so on. By 1970s, Wally Broecker was saying global warming was here, and and then Ramanathan, Jim Hansen, congressional testimony in 1988, and so on. But the American Petroleum Institute received a report in 1968 that it itself had commissioned from Stanford Research Institute, warning that CO2 will almost certainly cause major climatic changes, causing severe damage to the environment. But then they got into the business model. For 2 decades, they started manufacturing doubt on scientific consensus. People like Naomi Oreskes, I think, have written very nicely about this, Merchants of Doubt, and so on. So 1990, OISM distribute article typeset to appear like PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science. Western Fuels Association campaign reposition fact as a theory, and so on. I won't go through the details, but you can see that there have been systematic efforts that still go on looking at the publications and then adding some scientists who are willing to stand up and say something non-scientific, let's say, about climate change. We won't mention names, and then claim there was no consensus. And Heartland Institute has even produced huge IPCC-like report called NIPCC report, which were circulated, mailed out freely. I received copies, many people did, arguing against climate change. So Demerit in this sense suggested that efforts to win public trust by basing policy on a scientific certainty can actually increase public skepticism and make the resulting policy decisions more politically uncertain. So as scientists, we often probably overestimate the value of scientific certainty or even scientific knowledge in decision making. There are multiple factors involved, and politicians have to worry about winning elections, which is our favorite line, but they also have to pay a price for the decision they make, whereas scientists are not necessarily responsible for the policies they are advocating, right? So that has to be understood as well. They invite political opponents to conduct politics by waging war on underlying science and scientists. Michael Mann is an example who has really used it to write a lot about how war on science and scientists work, which in turn breeds scientific defensiveness rather than reflexive engagement in the face of criticism and debate. So this topic is very broad, as I said. I won't go into all the details, but societal response varies a full spectrum. European countries being very proactive in climate action, adaptation, mitigation, renewable energies, planning for sea level rise, etc. US remains skeptical and is not ever been a ratified partner in Kyoto or Paris, may change in the coming years. And poor countries in the meantime are empirically adapting to changes that are happening already, and provided their own nationally determined contributions to Paris Agreement like China and India and 192 countries have done. So it's a mixed bag. So society does respond in complicated ways to this complicated socioeconomic impact problem.